They told you the ocean was a wall. They told you the Americas were discovered by a man who was lost, funded by a crown that was broke, sailing toward a continent that was already home to millions. But receipts do not lie. And we have ours. The year is 1311, not 1492, 1311. Abu Bakr II, the Mansa, the emperor, the sovereign lord of the Mali Empire, commands the largest naval expedition in human history up to that point. Not a fishing expedition, not a trading run to a known shore. An expedition of discovery, launched into the open Atlantic from the West African coast, comprising 2,000 dugout canoes and supply vessels, carrying men, provisions, water in sealed gourds, and the full intellectual architecture of a civilization at its peak. The source, not a European journal, not a colonial footnote. The source is Ibn Battuta, citing the testimony of Mansa Musa himself, recorded in Cairo in 1324, 13 years after the fleet departed. Mansa Musa, on his legendary Hajj, sat before the scholars of Egypt and told them his predecessor had sailed west with 2,000 canoes, that only one ship returned, and that Abu Bakr II himself led the second fleet and never came back. That is the receipt. A sitting African emperor's first-hand account, recorded by the Arab world's most respected historian, citing the words of the empire's next ruler. This is not mythology. This is not oral tradition dismissed at the altar of European skepticism. This is primary documentation, the very standard of evidence that Western academia claims to require. So why have you never seen it in a classroom? Before we speak of what they found, we must speak of what they knew, because the erasure always begins with the same insult. How could they have gotten there? The answer is physics. The answer is mathematics. The answer is centuries of accumulated maritime science that the Mali Empire inherited from the civilizations that preceded it. The Atlantic Ocean is not a random body of water. It is a system, a hydraulic machine of currents and winds that flows in predictable, measurable patterns. The South Equatorial Current and the North Equatorial Current together form what oceanographers now call a natural maritime highway, running directly from the coast of Senegambia and Guinea, westward, toward the Caribbean and the northeastern coast of South America. Columbus did not discover this current. He used it, and he used it because Portuguese sailors, who had been studying the West African coast since the early 1400s, had already mapped its behavior from watching African fishermen and traders navigate it for generations. Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl proved in 1969 and 1970 that a papyrus reed vessel, far more primitive than the hardwood canoes of the Mali fleet, could complete the Atlantic crossing from Morocco to Barbados in 57 days, using only wind and current. He called it the Ra expedition. He called it a theory. We call it a confirmation. The vessels Abu Bakr commanded were not primitive. Ibn Battuta himself documented the size and sophistication of Mali River craft on the Niger. Malian maritime culture had mastered the Niger River system, one of the world's great hydraulic networks, for centuries before the Atlantic expedition. These were people who understood water, who read water, who governed water. 2,000 vessels, provisioned with dried meats, preserved grains, sealed water stores, organized in military formation under imperial command. This was not an accident. This was not a drift. This was a mission. Close your eyes for a moment. 1311, you are on the water. The fleet has been organized the way the Mali Empire organizes everything with sovereign precision. There are supply chains. There are designated canoes for fresh water, sealed in fired clay gourds. There are vessels carrying dried kola, millet, dried fish from the Senegal River Delta. There are soldiers, navigators, and we have every reason to believe griots, the oral historians of the empire, because no Malian expedition of this magnitude went anywhere without those who were charged with remembering. And when we ask what they found, the archaeology is beginning to answer. Archaeologist Mariana Petri Cabral and her colleagues working in the Amazon basin have used LiDAR technology, the same laser mapping system that shattered the myth of the empty jungle, by revealing hundreds of previously unknown pre-Columbian urban sites beneath the Amazon canopy, to document geometric earthworks and settlement patterns in the Amazon and Marajo Island region that predate Columbus and bear no connection to known indigenous architectural traditions of the period. We are not claiming these structures are solely African. We are doing something more intellectually sovereign than that. We are asking the question that the discipline has refused to ask. What happens to the material culture when two sophisticated civilizations make contact? Because contact, sustained, intentional contact, leaves evidence. The Olmec colossal heads of Mexico, those monumental basalt sculptures dating between 1500 BCE and 400 BCE, have generated decades of deliberate academic avoidance because their features, documented by physical anthropologists across multiple independent studies, bear consistent West African morphological characteristics. Scholar Ivan van Sertima, in his landmark 1976 work They Came Before Columbus, compiled the botanical, sculptural, linguistic, and navigation evidence into an argument so rigorous that it has never been disproven, only dismissed. There is a difference. The bottle gourd native to Africa was present in the Americas no later than 8,000 years ago. Seeds do not swim oceans alone. Cotton of African origin, the African baobab's chemical relatives, peanuts, yams. The botanical fingerprint of West African civilization is written into the soil of the Americas so deeply that the seeds themselves constitute a receipt. So why don't you know this? That is not a passive question. That is an indictment. The suppression of the 1311 expedition is not an oversight. It is a structural requirement of the colonial narrative. Because if Abu Bakr II's fleet reached the Americas, and the cumulative weight of Arabic documentation, oceanographic physics, botanical evidence, archaeological LiDAR mapping, and physical anthropological data says that it did, then the entire mythology of European discovery collapses. And with it collapses the intellectual justification for colonialism itself. The premise that Africans were passive, waiting to be discovered, civilized, named, dies the moment you acknowledge that an African emperor sent 2,000 ships into the unknown 181 years before Columbus begged Ferdinand and Isabella for 3. They buried Ivan van Sertima in academic ridicule. They called his methodology Afrocentric. As though having a center, as though being the subject of your own history rather than the object of someone else's, were a disqualifying bias. While the most Eurocentric assumptions in archaeology were published as neutral, objective, universal science. The Smithsonian Institution, in its official position on pre-Columbian contact, has repeatedly marginalized the Mali expedition evidence by applying an asymmetric standard of proof, demanding peer-reviewed archaeological corroboration for African contact claims, while simultaneously accepting Norse contact at Elance, Ox Meadows on far thinner initial evidence. The Norse settlement, real, documented, valid, was accepted into the canonical record because it did not destabilize the foundational mythology of Western civilization. African contact would, and there is one more receipt. The Portuguese cartographers who drew the earliest maps of the South American coastline did so with a precision that had no official explanation. They mapped rivers, bays, and inlets that no documented European expedition had reached. The standard explanation is secret voyages. But there is another explanation, one that the archive whispers if you know how to listen. Someone was already there, someone with knowledge of those shores, someone who, perhaps, greeted the first Portuguese ships not as strangers encountering a new world, but as sovereigns watching visitors arrive on already known land. We do not need their validation to know what our ancestors did. But we will take the evidence anyway, because it belongs to us. The receipts have always belonged to us. Abu Bakr II did not disappear into the Atlantic. He sailed into an ocean that his civilization understood, commanding a fleet that his empire built, toward a horizon that his navigators had reasoned was reachable. What happened when they arrived, what languages were spoken, what alliances were made, what knowledge was exchanged, may never be fully recovered, because the erasure was thorough. It was deliberate, it was funded. But the bones of that encounter are still in the ground. The plants are still growing. The currents are still flowing west, and the LDAR is still scanning. We are the descendants of a people who looked at the edge of the known world and said, "Keep going." Not because they were reckless, because they were rigorous. Because the Mali Empire of 1311 was the wealthiest, most administratively sophisticated empire on the planet, commanding more gold than any European kingdom, educating scholars at the University of Sankore in Timbuktu who were solving algebraic equations, while Oxford was still burning its heretics, operating a postal and legal system of such complexity that Ibn Battuta, who had traveled from Morocco to China, called it the most just society he had ever witnessed. These were not men stumbling toward the unknown. The suppressed truth of 1311 is not a debate. It is an accounting. And history, real history, not the version curated to protect a mythology, is beginning to pay what is owed. They tried to make the ocean a wall. Our ancestors made it a road. These were sovereigns extending their reach before Columbus, before the flag, before the fiction. We were already there.